The text message that changed everything arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night while I was cramming for my final business law exam. The notification lit up my phone screen in the darkness of my tiny studio apartment, and what I read made my blood freeze in my veins. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma, sweetheart, I just got off the phone with your father. We're so sorry about everything that's happened with your college fund. We had no idea the investment company was fraudulent. Love, Diane. I stared at the message, reading it over and over again, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in the silence of my room. Investment company? Fraudulent? What college fund? For the past 4 years, I'd been told there was no money for my education. I'd worked double shifts at 3 different part-time jobs, lived on ramen noodles and dollar store groceries, and taken out crushing student loans just to afford my tuition at Pacific Coast University. My stepmother, Diane, had always claimed the family couldn't afford to help with my college expenses, despite the fact that my father, Brad, owned the most successful auto dealership in Riverside Hills, California. But this text message suggested something entirely different. It implied there had been money set aside for my education all along, money that had apparently been lost to some kind of investment fraud, money that I'd never even known existed. While I'd been struggling to survive financially for years, my hands trembled as I screenshot the message, some instinct telling me this was important evidence of something much bigger than a simple miscommunication. The timestamp, the exact wording, the casual way Diane mentioned a college fund that I'd been told never existed. Everything about this text felt wrong, like a puzzle piece that didn't fit the picture I'd been given of my family's financial situation. I thought back to all the times I'd asked for help with college expenses, only to be told the family was stretched too thin financially. The times I'd watched my half-siblings Madison and Tyler get brand new cars for their birthdays while I rode. The bus to my minimum wage jobs, the countless school events where I'd been forced to wear thrift store dresses and hand-me-down shoes, while Madison strutted around in designer outfits that cost more than I made in a month. The most humiliating memory hit me like a physical blow. Riverside Hills High School's spring gala during my senior year, the biggest social event of the academic calendar. Every family in our affluent community attended, dressed to the nines, and competing to display their wealth and success. I'd begged Diane for something decent to wear, explaining how important this event was for seniors. She'd handed me a bag of clothes from the local thrift shop and told me to be grateful for what I had. I'll never forget walking into that ballroom wearing a faded purple dress that was 2 sizes too big, my shoes held together with clear tape, while Madison floated past me in a $700 gown that Diane had special ordered from San Francisco. The looks I received from classmates and their parents weren't just pity, they were confusion. Everyone knew my father owned Carter Family Motors, one of the most successful businesses in town. They couldn't understand why his daughter looked like she'd been dressed by charity. But now, staring at this text message in my dark apartment, a horrible possibility was beginning to form in my mind. What if there had been money for my education all along? What if my years of financial struggle, public humiliation, and exclusion from family activities hadn't been due to genuine financial hardship, but something far more sinister? I grabbed my laptop and began searching for any information about investment fraud cases in California. Page after page of results showed various schemes and scams, but nothing that mentioned my family or any company they might have invested with. I tried searching for my father's business, Carter Family Motors, combined with terms like lawsuit, fraud, and investigation, but found nothing relevant. The more I searched, the more suspicious I became. If my family had truly been victims of investment fraud significant enough to wipe out my entire college fund, wouldn't there be some kind of paper trail, police reports, news coverage, legal proceedings? Wouldn't my parents have mentioned this devastating financial loss during the years I'd been struggling to pay for school? Instead, I'd watched them take expensive vacations to Hawaii and Europe, while I worked nights at the campus library to afford textbooks. I'd seen them renovate their kitchen with $30,000 worth of custom cabinets, while I ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner 3 nights a week. If they'd lost a significant amount of money to fraud, their lifestyle certainly hadn't reflected it. My roommate Jessica stirred in her bed across the room, mumbling something about turning off the laptop light. I whispered an apology and closed the computer, but my mind was racing too fast for sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying years of memories through this new lens of suspicion. The pattern that emerged was disturbing and consistent. Every time I'd needed financial support for school activities, college preparation, or basic necessities, I'd been told the family couldn't afford it. But Madison and Tyler, my half-siblings who were Diane's biological children, seemed to have unlimited access to whatever they wanted. New clothes for every season, expensive electronics, private tutoring, summer camps, and eventually luxury cars when they turned 16. I remembered asking my father directly about this disparity when I was 17, shortly before high school graduation. I'd approached him in his home office, surrounded by evidence of the family's financial success, and asked why I was treated so differently from my siblings when it came to money. "Emma, honey," he'd said without looking up from his paperwork, "you're almost 18. It's time you learned the value of hard work and independence. Madison and Tyler are still young, but you're practically an adult. This will be good for your character." At the time, I'd accepted this explanation, even felt a little proud that my father considered me mature enough to handle adult responsibilities. But now I realized how convenient this philosophy had been for him and Diane. It provided a noble-sounding justification for treating me as a second-class family member while lavishing resources on their biological children. The next morning, I called my father's office at the dealership, something I rarely did since our conversations were usually brief and uncomfortable. His secretary, Mrs. Patterson, put me through immediately, probably assuming it was some kind of family emergency since I never called during business hours. "Emma? Is everything all right?" Brad's voice carried that familiar tone of mild irritation mixed with concern, as if my very existence was both worrying and inconvenient. "I got a strange text from Diane last night about a college fund and investment fraud. I was hoping you could explain what happened because I don't remember anyone ever mentioning that I had a college fund." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. In that silence, I could practically hear my father's mind working, trying to figure out how to respond to a question he obviously hadn't expected. "Oh, that. Yes, well, it's complicated, Emma. We had set aside some money for your education years ago, but we ended up having to use it for other family expenses. Then when we tried to recoup those funds through an investment opportunity, the whole thing turned out to be fraudulent. We didn't want to get your hopes up about money that might not materialize, so we decided not to mention it." Every word of his explanation felt rehearsed and hollow. If they'd had money set aside for my education but used it for other expenses, why had I been told for years that there simply wasn't money available for my college costs? And why was I only hearing about this investment fraud now, years after it allegedly occurred? "What was the name of the investment company?" I asked, pulling out a notebook to write down his answer. Another pause. "I don't remember off the top of my head. Diane handled most of those details. You could ask her about it." "How much money are we talking about?" "Emma, I don't think it's productive to dwell on money that's gone. The important thing is that you're doing well in school and learning to be independent. That's worth more than any amount we could have given you." The conversation ended with my father claiming he had an important client meeting, but I could hear the relief in his voice as he hung up. He'd managed to deflect my questions without providing any concrete information about this supposed investment fraud, and I suspected that was exactly what he'd intended to do. I spent the rest of the morning in the university library, not studying for my exam, but researching everything I could find about financial fraud and family law. What I discovered was enlightening and disturbing. In California, parents have a legal obligation to support their minor children financially, but they also have broad discretion in how they allocate resources among multiple children. However, if money had been specifically set aside for one child's education and then diverted to other purposes without that child's knowledge, it could constitute a form of financial abuse or fraud. More interesting was what I learned about asset protection and family finances. Wealthy families often set up education trusts and investment accounts specifically to ensure their children's future educational costs are covered. If my parents had indeed established such a fund for me, there should be documentation, tax records, and financial statements showing its existence and eventual disposition. My business law textbook had an entire chapter on fiduciary duty and financial fraud within families. As I read through case studies of parents who had stolen or misappropriated funds intended for their children, I felt a growing sense of recognition. The patterns described in these legal cases matched my own experience remarkably closely. Adult children discovering that money intended for their benefit had been diverted to support other family members or lifestyle expenses. Parents who provided elaborate explanations for why promised support wasn't available while maintaining expensive habits that suggested otherwise. But what struck me most was learning about the legal remedies available to victims of family financial fraud. Adult children who could prove their parents had stolen or misappropriated funds intended for them could pursue civil litigation and, in some cases, criminal charges. The law recognized that financial abuse within families was a serious crime, not just a family disagreement about money management. I thought about all those school events where I'd been humiliated by my appearance while my siblings dressed like royalty. The spring gala wasn't an isolated incident. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There had been homecoming dances, winter formals, graduation ceremonies, and dozens of other occasions where my obvious financial deprivation had been on public display in a community that valued wealth and status above almost everything else. The revelation that would change everything came 3 days later, completely by accident. I was helping my roommate Jessica clean out her car when she pulled a crumpled envelope from under the passenger seat and handed it to me with a confused expression. "This has your name on it, but I have no idea how it got in my car. Did you leave it there?" The envelope was addressed to Emma Carter in handwriting I didn't recognize, with no return address or postmark. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with a brief anonymous message that made my hands shake as I read it. "Emma, you deserve to know the truth about your college fund. Check the records at First National Bank of Riverside Hills. Account number 447123987756. Your grandmother. Sarah Carter set this up for you before she died. Ask about the monthly withdrawals." My grandmother Sarah had passed away when I was 15, and I remembered her as a kind, generous woman who had always treated me with special affection. She'd been my father's mother, and I'd always assumed that her small inheritance had been used for general family expenses. But this note suggested something entirely different. Jessica watched my face as I processed the implications of what I was reading. "Emma, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I think my family has been stealing from me for years," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And I think I might be able to prove it." The next morning, I dressed in my most professional outfit and walked into First National Bank of Riverside, Hills with the account number clutched in my sweaty palm. I approached the customer service desk and explained that I needed information about an account that might have been set up in my name by my deceased grandmother. The bank representative, a middle-aged woman named Carol, typed the account number into her computer and frowned at the screen. "I can see there was an account with this number, but it was closed about 2 years ago. I can print you a summary of account activity, but I'll need to verify your identity and relationship to the account holder." After providing my driver's license and answering several security questions, Carol handed me a 3-page printout that contained information that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The account had been opened in 2009 with an initial deposit of $85,000 from the estate of Sarah Carter. According to the documentation, the account was established as an education trust for Emma Carter with my father Brad. Carter listed as the trustee until I reached the age of 18. But the most devastating information was in the transaction history. Starting in 2012, when I was 15 years old, there had been regular monthly withdrawals from the account. $500 every month for nearly 6 years, until the account was finally closed in 2021, with a final withdrawal of the remaining balance. The timing of these withdrawals corresponded exactly with the period when I'd been told my family couldn't afford to help with my educational expenses. While I'd been working multiple jobs and taking out student loans to pay for college, someone had been systematically draining an account that contained money specifically intended for my education. According to the bank records, every withdrawal had been authorized by Brad Carter in his capacity as account trustee. The money that should have covered my entire college education had been taken $500 at a time over the course of years, while I'd been struggling financially and being told that no help was available. Carol must have seen the shock and devastation on my face because she offered to print additional documentation and suggested I speak with a bank manager about my options. The manager, a serious man named Mr. Rodriguez, reviewed the records and explained that since my father had been the legal trustee, the withdrawals were technically authorized under the terms of the account. However, he added, trustees have a fiduciary duty to use trust funds for their intended purpose. If this money was withdrawn for purposes other than your education, that could constitute a breach of fiduciary duty or fraud. Mr. Rodriguez provided me with certified copies of all account records and suggested I consult with an attorney who specialized in trust and estate law. He also mentioned that the bank was required to report suspicious account activity to relevant authorities if fraud was suspected. I left the bank with a folder full of documentation that proved my family had been lying to me for years. The college fund hadn't been lost to investment fraud. It had been systematically stolen by my own father, while I'd been struggling to survive financially as a student. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of anger, grief, and determination. I thought about all the times I'd gone to bed hungry because I couldn't afford groceries, the nights I'd worked until 2 a.m. at minimum wage jobs while my classmates were studying or socializing. The humiliation of wearing thrift store clothes to formal events, while Madison sparkled in designer gowns that probably cost more than my grandmother had intended for my entire education. But beneath the anger was something else. A cold, calculating fury that reminded me why I'd chosen to major in business administration with a focus on corporate law. I understood contracts, fiduciary duty, and financial fraud. I knew how to research, document, and build cases. And I was about to use every skill I'd learned to ensure that my family faced consequences for what they'd done to me. Jessica was waiting in our apartment when I returned, her face full of concern and curiosity. I spread the bank documents across our tiny dining table and explained what I'd discovered. As she read through the records, her expression shifted from confusion to horror to outrage. "Emma, this is theft. Your own family stole your education, money, and then made you suffer for years while they spent it. This isn't just wrong, it's criminal." She was right, and I was beginning to understand the full scope of what had been done to me. This wasn't just about the money, though $85,000 would have completely changed my college experience and future prospects. This was about a systematic campaign of financial abuse designed to keep me dependent and subordinate, while elevating Madison and Tyler at my expense. I thought about Diane's text message that had started this investigation. She'd mentioned investment fraud as if it was a recent discovery, but the bank records showed the account had been systematically drained over years and finally closed 2 years ago. There had been no sudden loss to fraudulent investments. There had been a deliberate, methodical theft of funds intended for my benefit. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was more sinister than I'd initially imagined. My family hadn't just failed to support my education. They'd actively stolen money that was meant for me, and then forced me to struggle financially while they enjoyed the benefits of my grandmother's generosity. The humiliation at school events, the constant financial stress, the years of student loan debt that would follow me for decades, all of it had been unnecessary and preventable if they'd simply used my education fund for its intended purpose. But what made it even worse was the psychological manipulation that had accompanied the theft. I'd been told repeatedly that I needed to learn independence and responsibility, that struggling financially would build my character. I'd been made to feel guilty for asking for help, and ungrateful for questioning the disparity between my treatment and that of my siblings. Now I understood that these lectures about character building had been a smokescreen designed to distract me from the real reason I was being denied support. It wasn't about teaching me valuable life lessons. It was about covering up the fact that they were stealing from me while using my grandmother's money to fund their preferred children's lifestyle. The realization filled me with a determination I'd never felt before. This wasn't just about recovering stolen money, though I intended to do that. This was about exposing a systematic pattern of abuse and ensuring that my family faced appropriate consequences for their actions. They'd counted on my ignorance and passivity to keep their secrets safe. They were about to learn that they'd gravely underestimated my intelligence, my persistence, and my commitment to justice. I picked up my phone and started researching attorneys in the Riverside Hills area who specialized in trust and estate litigation. It was time to build a case that would not only recover my stolen education fund, but expose the truth about my family's treatment of me to the entire community that had witnessed my humiliation for years. The first attorney's office I called was Thompson and Associates, a firm that advertised expertise in family financial disputes and fiduciary fraud. The receptionist scheduled a consultation for the following Monday, giving me the weekend to organize my documentation and prepare for what would become the beginning of the most important legal battle of my life. The law office of Thompson and Associates occupied the third floor of a sleek glass building in downtown Riverside Hills, the kind of place that screamed expensive legal representation. As I sat in the reception area Monday morning, clutching my folder of bank documents and wearing my best interview suit, I tried to calm my nerves by studying the framed diplomas and awards covering the walls. David Thompson turned out to be a man in his early 50s with silver hair and the kind of confident demeanor that comes from winning difficult cases. His handshake was firm, his office impressive, and his initial assessment of my situation was both encouraging and sobering. "Miss Carter, what you've uncovered appears to be a clear case of breach of fiduciary duty at minimum, and quite possibly criminal fraud," he said after reviewing the bank records. "Your father, as trustee of your education fund, had a legal obligation to use those funds solely for your educational benefit. The systematic withdrawals over multiple years suggest deliberate misappropriation rather than a simple mistake or misunderstanding." David explained that trust law in California was very specific about trustee responsibilities. When someone accepts the role of trustee for another person's benefit, they become legally bound to act in that person's best interests. Using trust funds for purposes other than those specified in the trust documents constituted a serious breach of that duty. The fact that these withdrawals coincided with your period of financial need for educational expenses makes this particularly egregious, David continued. Your father wasn't just stealing from the trust. He was forcing you to incur debt and hardship while he had access to funds specifically intended to prevent exactly that situation. But David also warned me that pursuing legal action against family members was complicated and emotionally difficult. Family financial disputes tend to get very ugly very quickly. Your father and stepmother will likely hire their own attorney and fight these allegations aggressively. They may try to claim the withdrawals were legitimate educational expenses or that you somehow benefited from the money in ways you don't remember. I thought about this possibility and realized it was actually laughable. Every aspect of my educational experience had been a struggle because of lack of funds. I had detailed records of student loans, work schedules, and financial aid applications that would prove exactly how little support I'd received from my family. If they claimed the stolen money had been used for my education, I could easily demonstrate. Otherwise, David agreed to take my case on a contingency basis, meaning I wouldn't have to pay attorney fees unless we recovered money from my family. He also suggested that we immediately begin gathering additional evidence beyond the bank records, including documentation of my family's lifestyle and spending during the period when they were draining my education fund. We need to build a comprehensive picture of financial fraud and abuse, David explained. The bank records prove they took your money, but we also need to show how they used it and how their actions specifically harmed you. The more detailed our evidence, the stronger our position in negotiations or trial. Over the next week, I threw myself into research and documentation with the same intensity I'd applied to my college studies. I gathered every piece of financial evidence I could find, starting with my own records of student loans, work income, and educational expenses. The picture that emerged was stark and compelling. From 2018 to 2022, I'd taken out over $60,000 in student loans to cover tuition, fees, and living expenses. During the same period, I'd worked an average of 30 hours per week at various part-time jobs, earning barely enough to cover basic necessities like food, transportation, and textbooks. My academic transcripts showed that despite these financial pressures, I'd maintained a 3.7 GPA and made the dean's list multiple times. Meanwhile, my research into my family's spending during those same years revealed a very different financial picture. I combed through social media posts, local newspaper coverage, and public records to document their lifestyle and expenditures. What I found was both infuriating and legally significant. In 2019, while I was working double shifts to afford textbooks, my family had taken a 3-week vacation to Europe that included first-class flights and luxury hotels. Based on the photos Madison had posted on Instagram, the trip had probably cost more than $15,000. In 2020, they'd renovated their kitchen with custom cabinets and granite countertops that the local contractor had featured on his website as a $35,000 project. The most galling discovery was Madison's 16th birthday party in 2021. Diane had hired a professional event planner and rented the ballroom at the Riverside Hills Country Club for what the local society pages described as an elegant coming-of-age celebration for 150 guests. The party had featured a live band, professional photographer, and a custom cake that was nearly as tall as Madison herself. Conservative estimates suggested the event had cost at least $20,000. During the same month as Madison's extravagant party, I'd been living on peanut butter sandwiches and instant soup because I couldn't afford groceries and textbooks for the new semester. I'd applied for emergency financial aid from my university and been forced to skip meals to save money for basic school supplies. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source: my neighbor, Sarah Martinez, who had lived next door to my family for over 15 years. Sarah had always been kind to me, but I'd never discussed my family's financial situation with her directly. When I mentioned to Jessica that I was gathering evidence about my family's spending patterns, she suggested I talk to Sarah, who had a reputation for noticing everything that happened in the neighborhood. I approached Sarah carefully, explaining that I was dealing with some family financial issues and wondered if she'd observed anything about my family's lifestyle over the years. What she told me was both shocking and incredibly valuable for my legal case. "Oh, honey, I've been wondering about your situation for years," Sarah said as we sat in her living room with cups of coffee. "Your father and stepmother have been flashing money around like lottery winners, but I could see how differently they treated you compared to Madison and Tyler. It never made sense to me why you were always working so hard and looking so stressed, when your family was obviously wealthy." Sarah had kept detailed mental notes about my family's activities because she'd been increasingly concerned about what she witnessed. She'd seen luxury cars being delivered to our house, watched contractors, arrive for expensive home improvements, and observed the constant stream of shopping bags and packages that Madison and Tyler received. But what really bothered me, Sarah continued, was seeing you leave for work at 6 in the morning and come home after midnight, looking exhausted, while your siblings were getting picked up in different cars for various activities and social events. It was like you belonged to a different family entirely. Sarah agreed to provide a written statement documenting her observations of our family's spending patterns and my obvious exclusion from their financial benefits. Her testimony would be particularly valuable because she was a neutral third party, with no stake in the outcome of any legal proceedings. Armed with Sarah's statement and my growing collection of evidence, I scheduled a second meeting with David Thompson to discuss our next steps. David was impressed with the thoroughness of my documentation and felt we had the foundation for a very strong case. What you've assembled here goes far beyond simple breach of fiduciary duty, David explained. The pattern of systematic exclusion while other family members enjoyed lavish spending suggests intentional financial abuse. The contrast between your documented struggles and their documented luxury spending during the same time period is particularly compelling. David outlined several legal strategies we could pursue. The most straightforward approach would be a civil lawsuit seeking recovery of the stolen education funds plus interest and damages. However, given the systematic nature of the fraud and the amounts involved, he also recommended that we report the matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. Financial abuse of this magnitude, particularly when it involves breach of fiduciary duty, can constitute criminal fraud under California law, David explained. The fact that your father was in a position of trust as your trustee makes his actions particularly serious from a criminal law perspective. The possibility of criminal charges was both exciting and terrifying. I wanted my family to face real consequences for what they'd done, but I also understood that pursuing criminal prosecution would make this a very public matter. In a community like Riverside Hills, where reputation and social standing were paramount, criminal charges against a prominent local business owner would attract significant attention, but David helped me understand that publicity might actually work in our favor. Financial fraud cases are often resolved through plea negotiations and settlements because defendants want to avoid the reputational damage of a public trial. Your family's concern about their standing in the community could motivate them to resolve this matter quickly and fairly. As we developed our legal strategy, David also connected me with a private investigator named Maria Santos, who specialized in financial fraud cases. Maria's job would be to gather additional evidence about my family's financial activities and to investigate whether there might be other accounts or assets that were relevant to our case. Maria was a former forensic accountant who had worked with law enforcement on complex financial crimes before starting her own investigation firm. During our initial meeting, she explained how she would approach investigating my family's financial situation. We need to build a complete picture of your family's income, assets, and spending during the relevant time period, Maria explained. The bank records show they took your money, but we need to trace where that money went and whether there are other financial irregularities we should know about. Maria would examine public records, business filings, and property records to understand the full scope of my family's financial activities. She would also investigate whether there might be other accounts or investments that contained money that should have been used for my benefit. But perhaps most importantly, Maria would help document the timeline of events to establish the systematic nature of the fraud. Pattern evidence is crucial in financial abuse cases, she explained. We need to show that this wasn't a single bad decision or a misunderstanding, but a deliberate and ongoing scheme to deprive you of funds that were legally yours. While Maria began her investigation, I focused on gathering additional evidence about the impact the theft had on my life and future prospects. I calculated the total amount of student loan debt I'd incurred that could have been avoided if my education fund had been used properly. I documented the career opportunities I'd missed because I had to work instead of participating in internships or study abroad programs. I researched the compound interest that my stolen money could have, earned if it had been properly invested for my benefit. The financial impact was staggering. Beyond the $85,000 that had been stolen from my education fund, I could demonstrate additional damages of at least $50,000 in unnecessary student loan debt, lost opportunity, costs, and the ongoing financial burden I would carry for years because of their actions. But the emotional and psychological impact was even more significant. I began documenting the years of humiliation, stress, and family dysfunction that had resulted from their systematic financial abuse. The memories were painful to revisit, but they were crucial evidence of the broader harm their actions had caused. I thought about my senior year of high school, when college application deadlines were approaching, and I'd been paralyzed by anxiety about how I would afford higher education. I'd applied for every scholarship and grant program I could find, written countless essays about overcoming financial hardship, and worked extra hours to save money for application fees. Meanwhile, Madison and Tyler had been planning their own futures with the confidence that comes from knowing your family can afford whatever educational opportunities you might want to pursue. Madison had casually mentioned applying to expensive, private colleges because Daddy said not to worry about the cost. Tyler had signed up for expensive SAT prep courses and college counseling services without any concern about the financial burden on the family. The contrast in our experiences had been stark and painful, but I'd accepted it because I'd been told it was necessary for my character development. Now I understood that the financial stress and limitations I'd experienced had been artificially created by people who had access to money specifically intended to ensure I wouldn't face those hardships. As Maria's investigation progressed, she began uncovering additional evidence that supported our case and suggested the financial abuse might have been even more extensive than I'd initially realized. Property records showed that my parents had refinanced their house multiple times during the period when they were draining my education fund, pulling out significant equity that could have been used to support my education if they'd actually needed the money for family expenses. Business records for Carter Family Motors showed that the dealership had been consistently profitable during the years when I'd been told the family couldn't afford to help with my college costs. My father's personal income had actually increased substantially during that period, making their claims of financial hardship completely unsupportable. But the most shocking discovery came when Maria uncovered evidence of additional accounts that my grandmother had established for me. It turned out that the $85,000 education fund was only part of Sarah Carter's bequest to me. She had also set up a smaller account intended to provide me with spending money during college, and a savings account that was supposed to mature when I turned 25 to help with graduate school or starting a career. Both of these additional accounts had been systematically drained by my father using the same pattern of monthly withdrawals that had emptied my education fund. The total amount of money that had been stolen from me exceeded $130,000, not including the interest and investment growth that money could have generated over the years. Maria's investigation also revealed that my grandmother had specifically included provisions in her will requiring that I be informed about these accounts when I turned 18. My father, as the executor of her estate, had been legally obligated to notify me about my inheritance and to provide me with regular accountings of how the money was being managed. Not only had he failed to inform me about the accounts, but he had actively concealed their existence while systematically stealing from them. This elevated his actions from simple breach of fiduciary duty to criminal fraud and violation of probate law. Armed with this expanded evidence, David felt we were ready to take action. He recommended that we begin with a formal demand letter to my family, outlining what we had discovered and demanding immediate repayment of the stolen funds. The letter would also put them on notice that we were prepared to pursue both civil and criminal remedies if they didn't respond appropriately. Sometimes a well-crafted demand letter can resolve these matters without the need for protracted litigation, David explained. When people realize how much evidence exists against them and understand the potential consequences they're facing, they often decide that settlement is preferable to fighting. But David also warned me that my family's response to the demand letter would tell us a lot about how they intended to handle this situation. If they respond with denial, blame shifting, or attempts to justify their actions, it suggests they're going to fight this aggressively. If they respond with acknowledgement and a desire to make things right, we might be able to reach a reasonable settlement. As we prepared the demand letter, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that mysterious text message from Diane had first alerted me to the existence of my college fund. In just a few weeks, I'd gone from being a struggling college student who blamed herself for her family's apparent financial limitations to someone who understood that she'd been the victim of systematic financial abuse and fraud. The transformation wasn't just about understanding what had happened to me. It was about recognizing my own strength, intelligence, and worth. For years, I'd accepted my family's narrative that I needed to struggle and sacrifice to build character, while my siblings enjoyed privilege and support. Now I understood that their treatment of me had nothing to do with character building and everything to do with greed, favoritism, and calculated cruelty. But I also understood that knowledge without action was meaningless. My family had counted on my ignorance and passivity to keep their secret safe. They'd assumed that even if I discovered what they'd done, I wouldn't have the resources or determination to hold them accountable. They were about to learn how wrong they had been about my capabilities and my commitment to justice. The demand letter would be just the beginning of a legal and personal reckoning that would expose their actions to the scrutiny they deserved and ensure that they faced appropriate consequences for the harm they'd caused. As David finalized the demand letter, I prepared myself for what would likely be a difficult and contentious period ahead. But I also felt a sense of peace and purpose that I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since my grandmother's death, I was fighting for something that was rightfully mine, and I had the tools and support I needed to win that fight. The certified letter arrived at my family's house on a Thursday morning, delivered by a process server who ensured that someone had to sign for it personally. David had crafted the demand letter with surgical precision, outlining every piece of evidence we'd gathered and making it crystal clear that we had documented proof of systematic financial fraud spanning multiple years and accounts. I wasn't there to witness the delivery, but I didn't have to wait long for a response. My phone started ringing at 11:30 that morning with a call from my father that I let go to voicemail. By noon, I'd received 3 more missed calls from him and 2 from Diane. The voicemails progressed from confused to angry to desperate as the reality of their situation began to sink in. Jessica was with me in our apartment when I finally listened to the messages. The first one from my father was almost comical in its attempt to maintain innocence and authority. "Emma, I don't know what kind of legal nonsense you think you're pursuing, but this is ridiculous. We're a family, and families don't sue each other over misunderstandings. Call me back immediately so we can discuss this like adults." But by the fourth message, his tone had shifted dramatically as he apparently absorbed the full scope of what David's letter had revealed about our evidence. "Emma, listen. There might have been some confusion about how your grandmother's money was handled. Your stepmother made some decisions about investments that didn't work out the way we hoped. But this lawyer you've hired is obviously filling your head with lies to make money off our family. We can work this out without involving attorneys and making this a public spectacle." Diane's messages were even more revealing in their progression from denial to panic. Her first voicemail attempted to paint me as an ungrateful daughter who was attacking the family that had supported and loved me. "Emma, sweetheart, I'm so disappointed that you would believe these awful accusations against people who have only tried to help you. We've supported you through college in so many ways that don't show up in bank records. This lawyer is taking advantage of you, and you're going to regret destroying your family relationships over money." But her second message, left just an hour later, revealed a very different perspective as she apparently realized how much evidence we actually possessed. "Emma, please call me back. I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding about your grandmother's accounts. Your father and I made some decisions during difficult financial times that we can explain if you'll just give us a chance. We love you and want to make this right, but these legal threats are making everything so much worse." Jessica shook her head as she listened to the increasingly frantic messages. "They're scared, Emma. Really scared. They know they're caught, and now they're trying to figure out how to minimize the damage." David had predicted this exact reaction when we discussed how my family might respond to the demand letter. Financial fraudsters usually go through predictable stages when they're confronted with evidence, he'd explained. First denial, then minimization, then blame shifting, and finally desperate attempts at damage control. I didn't return any of their calls that day, following David's advice to let them stew in their anxiety while we prepared our next moves. But I did start documenting every attempt they made to contact me, creating a record of their increasingly desperate efforts to control the narrative before it spiraled completely out of their control. The next development came sooner than expected. On Friday afternoon, I received a call from Sarah Martinez asking if I could come over to discuss something important. When I arrived at her house, she was visibly agitated and explained that Diane had appeared at her door that morning in what could only be described as a damage control mission. "She wanted to know what I'd told you about observing your family's activities over the years," Sarah explained. "She kept insisting that there had been misunderstandings about your grandmother's money and that I shouldn't believe everything you might have said about the family's financial situation." According to Sarah, Diane had spent nearly an hour trying to convince her that I was an emotionally unstable young woman who was being manipulated by an unscrupulous attorney into pursuing false claims against my loving family. She'd painted a picture of me as someone who had always been resentful of my siblings' success and was now trying to get revenge by making up stories about financial abuse. "But Emma," Sarah said, looking directly at me with concern and determination, "I've known you since you were 12 years old. I've watched you work harder than any kid should have to work, maintain excellent grades despite financial stress, and treat your family with respect even when they didn't deserve it. There's nothing emotionally unstable about wanting answers when you discover your own family has been stealing from you." Sarah's account of Diane's visit was incredibly valuable for our case because it demonstrated consciousness of guilt and an attempt to tamper with a potential witness. David was delighted when I reported this development because it showed that my family understood exactly how damaging Sarah's testimony could be and were actively trying to undermine her credibility. Witness tampering is a serious issue that courts take very seriously, David explained. The fact that your stepmother went to Sarah's house to try to discredit your claims and influence her testimony shows that they know their actions were wrong and are now trying to cover up the evidence. But Sarah's report also revealed something else that would prove crucial to our strategy. During her conversation with Diane, my stepmother had inadvertently confirmed several key facts about the stolen money while trying to justify their actions. She admitted that they'd used your grandmother's money during what she called temporary financial difficulties, Sarah reported. She claimed they'd always intended to pay it back, but that investment losses had made it impossible. She also said that they'd been planning to tell you about the situation after you graduated from college. These admissions were legally significant because they constituted acknowledgments that the money had been taken and used for purposes other than my education. Even though Diane had tried to frame it as temporary borrowing with good intentions, she'd essentially confessed to the core elements of our fraud case. David immediately began preparing to take depositions from both Sarah and me to preserve our testimony before my family could make any additional attempts at witness intimidation. He also recommended that we accelerate our timeline for filing formal legal action rather than waiting for my family to respond to our demand letter with a meaningful settlement offer. They're clearly in crisis management mode rather than genuine resolution mode, David observed. The fact that they're trying to influence witnesses instead of addressing the substance of our claims suggests they're not acting in good faith. While David prepared our legal filings, Maria continued her investigation into my family's financial activities and uncovered additional evidence that strengthened our case even further. She'd obtained records showing that during the peak period of withdrawals from my education accounts, my parents had made several large cash purchases that suggested they'd had access to significant liquid funds. In 2020, they'd bought a luxury boat valued at over $40,000, paying in cash according to the sales records. In 2021, they'd purchased expensive jewelry for Diane's birthday, including a diamond necklace that the jeweler's insurance records valued at $15,000. These purchases coincided exactly with periods when they were taking money from my education accounts while telling me they couldn't afford to help with my college expenses. But Maria's most damaging discovery came when she uncovered evidence that my father had been systematically underreporting his business income to justify his claims of financial hardship. Carter Family Motors had been generating significantly more revenue than Brad had declared on loan applications and financial disclosures, suggesting that he'd been engaging in tax fraud in addition to stealing from my accounts. "This is a much bigger case than we initially realized," Maria explained during a meeting with David and me. "The financial fraud against Emma appears to be part of a broader pattern of financial misconduct that could have serious criminal implications." David agreed that the expanded evidence changed the scope of our case significantly. We're no longer just dealing with breach of fiduciary duty regarding trust accounts. We're looking at potential tax fraud, insurance fraud, and systematic financial deception that could interest both state and federal authorities. The prospect of criminal prosecution beyond just the theft of my education funds was both satisfying and terrifying. I wanted my family to face consequences proportional to the harm they'd caused, but I also understood that expanding criminal investigations could take years to resolve and would make this a very public matter in our small community. David helped me understand that we could pursue multiple strategies simultaneously. We can file civil litigation to recover your stolen funds while also reporting the potential criminal violations to appropriate authorities. The civil case will probably resolve more quickly and ensure you get your money back, while criminal prosecution will address the broader public interest in holding financial fraudsters accountable. As we prepared to file our civil lawsuit, I also made a decision that would prove crucial to achieving full accountability for my family's actions. I decided to document my story and share it publicly, both to warn other potential victims and to ensure that my family couldn't continue to present themselves as respectable community members while hiding their true character. I started by creating a detailed timeline of events that I could share with local media and community members who had witnessed my financial struggles over the years. The timeline included specific dates, amounts, and evidence that would make it impossible for my family to deny or minimize what they'd done. But I also began reaching out to other people who might have relevant information about my family's financial activities or treatment of me. I contacted former teachers who had witnessed my obvious financial struggles during high school. I spoke with former co-workers who had seen me working multiple jobs while my siblings enjoyed luxury lifestyles. I reached out to family friends who might have knowledge about my grandmother's intentions regarding her bequest to me. The response was overwhelming and heartbreaking. Multiple people told me they'd noticed the disparity in how I was treated, compared to Madison and Tyler, but hadn't felt it was their place to intervene. Several teachers mentioned that they'd considered reaching out to social services because my situation had seemed like potential neglect or abuse, but they'd been unsure how to address financial abuse within what appeared to be a wealthy family. Most significantly, I discovered that several people had direct knowledge of my grandmother's intentions regarding the money she'd left for me. My grandmother's former neighbor, Mrs. Chen, remembered conversations where Sarah Carter had specifically discussed her plans to ensure that I would have financial support for college and beyond. "Your grandmother was so worried about you," Mrs. Chen told me during a phone conversation. "She could see how differently your stepmother treated you compared to her own children, and she wanted to make sure you'd have resources to build an independent life. She specifically told me that she was setting up accounts that would give you financial security, even if your parents didn't support you properly." these conversations with community members served multiple purposes for our legal case. They provided additional evidence of my grandmother's intentions and my family's deviation from those intentions. They also established a broader pattern of community awareness about my family's differential treatment of their children, which would make it harder for them to claim that the financial disparities were normal or justified. But perhaps most importantly, these conversations helped me understand that I hadn't been imagining or exaggerating the unfairness of my treatment. Multiple independent observers had noticed the same patterns of financial abuse and exclusion that I'd experienced. Their validation gave me additional confidence that pursuing legal action was the right thing to do, not just for me, but for the principle that financial abuse within families should have consequences. As news of my situation began to spread through our community's network of relationships, I started receiving support from unexpected sources. Former classmates reached out to express their dismay at learning about my family's treatment of me. Parents of my high school friends offered to provide statements about the obvious disparities they'd observed during school events and social gatherings. The principal of Riverside Hills High School, Helen Roberts, asked to meet with me privately to discuss what she'd observed during my time as a student. Principal Roberts had been in her position for over 20 years and had a reputation for caring deeply about student welfare and academic success. "Emma, I want you to know that several faculty members and I were concerned about your situation during your high school years," Principal Roberts explained. "We could see that you were working exceptionally hard academically, while also holding multiple part-time jobs, which was unusual for students from families with your apparent financial resources." Principal Roberts revealed that the school had actually considered intervening in my situation on multiple occasions. They'd noticed that I often seemed tired and stressed, that I frequently worked during school breaks when other students were relaxing, and that my appearance at formal school events suggested financial constraints that seemed inconsistent with my family's apparent wealth. We discussed whether to contact social services or your parents directly, but financial neglect within apparently wealthy families is a gray area that's difficult for schools to address, she admitted. "We regret not taking more action, but we want you to know that your situation didn't go unnoticed." Principal Roberts also offered to provide documentation about academic achievements and extracurricular activities that I'd been unable to pursue due to financial constraints. She had records showing that I'd been selected for several prestigious academic programs and opportunities that required family financial support, but that I'd been forced to decline due to cost. "You were academically qualified for programs like Model United Nations, Student Government Leadership Conferences, and Advanced Placement Summer Institutes," she explained. "But these opportunities required family financial contributions that were apparently not available to you, even though they were available to your siblings for similar activities. This documentation would be valuable evidence of the specific educational and career opportunities that my family's financial abuse had cost me. Beyond the immediate theft of my education funds, their actions had deprived me of experiences and connections that could have enhanced my college applications and future career prospects. As David prepared our civil lawsuit filing, we incorporated all of this additional evidence to present a comprehensive picture of systematic financial abuse, spanning multiple years and affecting numerous aspects of my life. The lawsuit would seek not just recovery of the stolen funds, but additional damages for the educational opportunities, career prospects, and personal development that their actions had cost me. But we also prepared for the likelihood that my family would respond aggressively rather than seeking genuine resolution. David had experience with family financial fraud cases and warned me that defendants often escalated their tactics when they realized that legal action was inevitable. "They may try to claim that you're mentally unstable, that you're being manipulated by attorneys, or that you're motivated by greed rather than justice," David warned. "Financial fraudsters often try to shift blame to their victims and make the legal process as difficult and emotionally painful as possible." I understood that the coming months would be challenging, and that my family would probably try to destroy my reputation and credibility just as they'd tried to influence Sarah's testimony. But I also felt prepared for that battle in a way that I wouldn't have been just a few weeks earlier. The investigation and evidence-gathering process had given me something more valuable than just a strong legal case. It had given me a clear understanding of my own worth, my own strength, and my own right to be treated with fairness and respect. My family had counted on my continued acceptance of their narrative about my place in the family hierarchy. They were about to discover that I was no longer willing to accept anything less than full accountability for their actions and complete restitution for the harm they'd caused. The confrontation I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure came on a Tuesday evening when my father appeared at my apartment door unannounced. I heard the heavy knock while I was studying for my final exams, and when I looked through the peephole, I saw Brad standing in the hallway with an expression I'd never seen before. His usual confident composure had been replaced by something desperate and angry. Jessica was at her evening shift at the campus medical center, leaving me alone to face this encounter. I considered not answering the door, but I realized this moment was inevitable and might actually provide valuable evidence for our case. I discreetly started the voice recording app on my phone before opening the door. "We need to talk," Brad said without any greeting or pleasantries. His voice carried an edge of barely controlled fury that I'd never heard from him before. "This legal nonsense has gone far enough, Emma. You're destroying this family over money that you clearly don't understand." I stepped back to let him into the apartment but remained standing near the door, ready to leave or call for help if his behavior became threatening. The man who entered my small living space seemed like a stranger wearing my father's face. His usual calm authority had been replaced by agitation and something that looked like panic. "I understand perfectly," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I understand that you stole over $130,000 that my grandmother left specifically for my education and future. I understand that you spent years lying to me about why you couldn't help with college expenses while you were taking money that was legally mine." Brad's face flushed red at my direct accusation. "That money was invested for your benefit, but the investments failed. We were trying to grow your inheritance, not steal it. This lawyer you've hired is filling your head with lies and turning you against your own family." "What investments, Dad? What company? What happened to the money?" I pressed, knowing that his explanations wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. "Because the bank records show systematic monthly withdrawals over 6 years, not investment losses." "You don't understand how these things work," Brad said, his voice rising with frustration. "Sometimes families have to make difficult financial decisions during challenging times. We always intended to replace that money once the business improved." "The business that bought a $40,000 boat in 2020? The business that paid for Madison's $20,000 birthday party? The business that somehow couldn't afford to help me buy textbooks?" My voice was getting stronger as I spoke, fed by years of suppressed anger finally finding expression. Brad's composure cracked completely at my specific knowledge of their expenditures. "You have no idea what you're talking about. That boat was a business expense for client entertainment. Madison's party was an investment in our family's social standing. Everything we did was for the benefit of this family, including you. How exactly did stealing my education money benefit me? How did forcing me to work multiple jobs and take out massive student loans benefit me? How did humiliating me at every school event while Madison wore designer dresses benefit me?" "You learned valuable lessons about hard work and independence," Brad shot back, falling back on the familiar justification I'd heard for years. "Madison and Tyler are younger and need more support right now. You're an adult who should be grateful for the character-building experiences we provided." The absurdity of calling systematic theft a character-building experience was so extreme that I almost laughed. "Character building? You stole money my grandmother left for me and then made me believe I was ungrateful for wanting basic support. That's not character building, Dad. That's financial abuse." Don't you dare use that term about your family, Brad snarled, taking a step closer to me in a way that felt threatening. We loved you and supported you in every way that mattered. If you pursue this legal action, you'll destroy relationships that can never be repaired. Is money really more important to you than family? Is money more important to you than treating your daughter fairly? I countered. Because your actions over the past 6 years suggest that money was definitely more important to you than my well-being or future success. Brad stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling to find a response that would regain control of the conversation. When he spoke again, his voice carried a cold edge that made me understand why I'd always felt slightly afraid of disappointing him. If you continue with this lawsuit, Emma, you need to understand the consequences. This family has standing in this community that we've worked decades to build. Your accusations could destroy that reputation and hurt innocent people like Madison and Tyler, who had nothing to do with these decisions. Madison and Tyler benefited directly from money that was stolen from me, I pointed out. They're not innocent victims. They're beneficiaries of financial fraud. They're children who don't deserve to have their futures ruined because their sister decided to get greedy and vindictive. Brad replied, If you force this into court, the whole community will see you as someone who destroyed her own family for money. Is that really the reputation you want? The threat was clear and calculated. Brad was trying to use my concern for my siblings and my standing in the community to pressure me into dropping the legal action. But his approach revealed how little he actually understood about my situation or my motivations. Dad, everyone in this community already saw you humiliate me at dozens of public events while you spent money that belonged to me on luxury items for your other children. My reputation was damaged years ago by your actions. The only difference now is that people will understand why those things happened. Brad's expression shifted to something uglier as he realized his intimidation tactics weren't working. You think you're so smart with your lawyers and your evidence, but you have no idea what you're up against. This family has resources and connections that you can't imagine. If you want to fight us in court, we'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you really are. What kind of person am I, Dad? Someone who worked 3 jobs to put herself through college? Someone who maintained excellent grades despite financial stress? Someone who treated her family with respect even when they didn't deserve it? I'm comfortable with people knowing exactly what kind of person I am. You're someone who's willing to destroy her own family for money, Brad said with venom. You're someone who's so selfish and greedy that you can't accept that sometimes parents have to make difficult financial decisions. You're someone who would rather see her siblings suffer than accept that you're not the center of the universe. The personal attacks were painful, but they were also legally significant. Brad was essentially admitting that difficult financial decisions had been made regarding my money while simultaneously trying to blame me for the consequences of those decisions. His anger was providing me with recorded evidence of his guilt and his consciousness of wrongdoing. If those financial decisions were legitimate, why didn't you tell me about them? Why did you lie about the existence of my education fund? Why did you make me believe there was no money available when you were actually spending money that belonged to me? Because we knew you'd react exactly like this, Brad exploded. We knew you'd be selfish and unreasonable and make everything about yourself instead of understanding the bigger picture of family finances. The bigger picture where I struggle and sacrifice while Madison and Tyler get everything they want? The bigger picture where I work myself to exhaustion while you take vacations to Europe with money my grandmother left for me? That bigger picture? Brad realized he was losing control of the conversation and tried to shift tactics one more time. Emma, I'm going to give you one last chance to handle this like an adult. Drop this lawsuit, fire your lawyer, and we can work out a family solution. That doesn't involve destroying everyone's reputation. But if you continue down this path, I promise you that we will fight this with everything we have. What kind of family solution did you have in mind? I asked, curious to see what he would offer when backed into a corner. "We could set up a payment plan to help you with your student loans. Maybe $500 a month for a few years until you get established in your career. It wouldn't be as much as you think you're owed, but it would be fair compensation for any misunderstandings about your grandmother's money." The offer was so insultingly inadequate that it confirmed everything I'd suspected about his lack of genuine remorse or understanding of the harm he'd caused. He was offering to pay me roughly $30,000 over 5 years to compensate for stealing over $130,000, plus interest and opportunity costs. $500 a month to replace $130,000 that you stole from me? Dad, that offer is proof that you still don't understand the magnitude of what you've done or the legal consequences you're facing. "Fine," Brad said, his voice turning ice cold. "If you want to play hardball, we'll play hardball. But don't say I didn't give you a chance to resolve this quietly and preserve some dignity for everyone involved." He headed toward the door, but turned back for one final threat. "Emma, I want you to think very carefully about what you're doing. Once you file that lawsuit, there's no going back. The things that will come out in court will change how everyone in this family sees each other forever. Are you really prepared for those consequences?" "I'm prepared for the truth to come out," I replied. "The question is whether you and Diane are prepared for the consequences of what you've done." After Brad left, I sat in my apartment shaking, from adrenaline and emotion. The confrontation had been more intense and revealing than I'd expected. My father had essentially confessed to taking my money while simultaneously trying to blame me for the consequences and threatening retaliation if I continued pursuing legal action. But more importantly, I'd discovered something about myself during that confrontation. The intimidation tactics that had worked on me as a child and teenager no longer had the same power. I was no longer afraid of Brad's anger or threats because I understood that his behavior came from a position of weakness rather than strength. He was scared because he knew he was guilty, and he was lashing out because he'd lost control of a situation he'd created through his own misconduct. I immediately called David to report the encounter and to provide him with the recording I'd made. David was extremely interested in Brad's admissions about making difficult financial decisions regarding my money and his threats about fighting the lawsuit with everything they had. "This recording is incredibly valuable evidence," David explained. "Your father essentially admitted to taking your money while also threatening retaliation if you continue pursuing legal remedies. That combination of admission and intimidation will be very compelling to a judge or jury." David also pointed out that Brad's inadequate settlement offer demonstrated a lack of good faith that would work against them in any future negotiations. Offering $30,000 to settle a $130,000 theft shows that they're not serious about making this right. It suggests they're hoping to minimize their losses rather than providing fair compensation for their actions. More concerning was Brad's threat about fighting with everything they had. David warned me that this probably meant they were preparing to escalate their tactics beyond simple legal defense to include personal attacks on my character and credibility. Family financial fraud cases often get very ugly because defendants feel like they have nothing to lose once the truth comes out, David explained. They may try to claim you're mentally unstable, that you're being manipulated by lawyers, or that you have ulterior motives for pursuing this case. But David also assured me that we were well prepared for these tactics because of the comprehensive evidence we'd gathered. They can make personal attacks, but they can't change the bank records, the witness statements, or the documented pattern of their spending during the period when they were stealing your money. The next phase of escalation came sooner than expected. Within 48 hours of Brad's visit to my apartment, I began receiving calls and messages from extended family members who had obviously been contacted by my parents and given their version of events. My father's brother, Uncle Tom, called to express his disappointment that I was tearing the family apart over financial disagreements. My step-aunt Patricia left a voicemail suggesting that I was letting lawyers take advantage of my emotions to make money off family problems. Even Madison reached out with a text message claiming that I was hurting everyone with these crazy accusations. But the most revealing communication came from my cousin Jennifer, who had always been close to the family and had witnessed many of the events I was describing in my legal case. Jennifer called to tell me that she'd been contacted by Diane and asked to provide a statement about my mental state and behavior at family gatherings. "Emma, they're trying to get me to say that you've always been difficult and resentful about money, and that you've had emotional problems that might explain why you're making these accusations," Jennifer explained. "But I can't do that because it's not true. I've watched how they treated you compared to Madison and Tyler for years, and it was never fair." Jennifer's call revealed that my family was actively trying to recruit character witnesses who would support their narrative that I was emotionally unstable and motivated by greed, rather than legitimate grievances. But their approach was backfiring because people who had actually observed our family dynamics over the years could see through their attempts at revisionist history. More importantly, Jennifer offered to provide her own statement supporting my case. "I remember your grandmother talking about the money she was leaving for your education," Jennifer said. "She was very specific about wanting to make sure you'd have financial independence even if your parents didn't support you properly. She would be horrified to know that money was taken from you." David was pleased but not surprised by these developments. "It's very common for financial fraud defendants to try to recruit family members and friends to attack the victim's credibility," he explained. "But it usually backfires because people who know the truth can see what's happening." As my family ramped up their character assassination campaign, I made a decision that would prove crucial to exposing their tactics and protecting my reputation. I decided to go public with my story in a way that would make it impossible for them to control the narrative or manipulate potential witnesses. I contacted the lifestyle reporter at the Riverside Hills Gazette, the local newspaper that covered community events and social issues. The reporter, Amanda Walsh, had actually written several articles over the years about local high school students who had overcome financial challenges to achieve academic success. She was immediately interested in my story because it revealed a different perspective on wealth and family dynamics in our affluent community. Amanda's article, which ran on the front page of the Sunday Lifestyle section, was titled "The Hidden Cost of Family Financial Abuse: A Local Student's Fight for Justice." The piece provided a detailed but respectful account of my situation, including specific evidence of the stolen education funds and the impact their theft had on my college experience. But what made the article particularly powerful was the context Amanda provided about financial abuse within families and the legal remedies available to victims. She interviewed experts about trust law, fiduciary duty, and the signs that family members might be experiencing financial exploitation. The community response to the article was immediate and overwhelming. I received dozens of calls, emails, and messages from people expressing support and sharing their own stories of financial mistreatment within families. Several people offered to provide additional evidence about my family's spending patterns and treatment of me during high school. But most significantly, the article prompted 3 other young adults in our community to come forward with similar stories about financial abuse by family members. The publicity surrounding my case had given them the courage and information they needed to address their own situations. The article also forced my family to respond publicly, rather than just manipulating private conversations with relatives and friends. Brad issued a statement to the newspaper, claiming that the family disputes were being misrepresented by lawyers seeking to profit from family problems, and that they were confident the legal system would reveal the truth about the situation. But Diane made a crucial error by responding more defensively to a follow-up inquiry from Amanda Walsh. In an interview that she apparently thought would help their case, Diane essentially confirmed several key facts while trying to justify their actions. "Emma has always been a difficult child who resented her siblings' success," Diane told the reporter. "We made some financial decisions during challenging times that we can explain in court. But we never did anything illegal, and we're confident." That Emma will realize she's been misled by people who don't have her best interests at heart. The interview provided us with additional evidence of their attempts to discredit my character, while also containing admissions about making financial decisions that affected my money. David was thrilled with Diane's public statements because they contradicted several aspects of their anticipated legal defense. She just admitted to making financial decisions during challenging times while also claiming they did nothing wrong, David pointed out. That's going to be very difficult to reconcile with their anticipated argument that they were always acting in your best interests. As the public attention around my case intensified, my family's efforts to control the narrative became increasingly desperate and counterproductive. They hired their own attorney, a local lawyer named Robert Sterling, who specialized in defending wealthy clients against various accusations. Sterling's first move was to hold a press conference, claiming that I was a troubled young woman who was being manipulated by unscrupulous attorneys into making false accusations against a loving family. He suggested that my allegations were motivated by greed and resentment rather than legitimate grievances. But Sterling's approach backfired spectacularly because he made several factual claims that were easily disproven by the evidence we'd already made public. He claimed that I had received substantial financial support for college that I was now ungratefully minimizing. He suggested that the family's financial situation had been much more precarious than I was acknowledging. He even implied that my grandmother's intentions regarding her bequest were being misrepresented. David responded to Sterling's press conference with a detailed statement that included specific evidence contradicting every major claim Sterling had made. The bank records, the witness statements, and the documentation of my family's luxury, spending during the period when they were claiming financial hardship, made Sterling's defense look both factually wrong and morally questionable. The public back and forth between our legal teams had an unexpected benefit. It forced all the evidence into the public record in a way that made it impossible for my family to continue denying or minimizing what they'd done. The community could see the specific amounts involved, the timeline of theft, and the contrast between their claims of financial hardship and their documented spending on luxury items. But more importantly, the publicity had attracted the attention of law enforcement, agencies that were interested in the potential criminal aspects of my family's financial activities. Detective Karen Mills from the Riverside Hills Police Department contacted David to discuss referring my case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. The systematic nature of the financial fraud and the amounts involved suggest this could be a felony case, Detective Mills explained. We'd like to interview your client and review the evidence to determine whether criminal charges are appropriate. The prospect of criminal charges was both satisfying and nerve-wracking. I wanted my family to face consequences proportional to the harm they'd caused. But I also understood that criminal prosecution would make this situation even more public and contentious than it already was. David helped me understand that criminal prosecution would proceed independently of our civil case and might actually strengthen our position in settlement negotiations. Defendants facing potential criminal charges are often more motivated to resolve civil cases quickly and favorably, he explained. As we prepared for what looked like both civil litigation and criminal investigation, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that initial text message from Diane had alerted me to the existence of my college fund. I'd gone from being an isolated victim of financial abuse to someone who was holding her family accountable while inspiring others to address similar situations. The transformation wasn't just about legal strategy or evidence gathering. It was about understanding my own worth and refusing to accept treatment that was fundamentally unfair and harmful. My family had counted on my continued compliance with their narrative about my place in the family hierarchy. Instead, they were about to discover that their actions had consequences they'd never anticipated, and that the truth had a power they couldn't control or manipulate. The criminal investigation moved faster than anyone had anticipated. Detective Mills's preliminary review of our evidence convinced the Riverside County District Attorney's Office that my family's financial activities warranted immediate criminal charges. Within 3 weeks of the initial police interview, my father, stepmother, and even Madison were arrested on multiple felony counts of financial fraud, theft, and conspiracy. I wasn't present for the arrests, but the local news coverage showed the devastating moment when Brad Carter was led away from his auto dealership in handcuffs during the busy afternoon rush. The image of the successful businessman being arrested at his own company became the lead story on every local news program, and the front page of both the Riverside Hills Gazette and the countywide newspaper. Diane was arrested at their home while Tyler was at school, sparing him the immediate trauma of watching his mother being taken into custody. But Madison's arrest was particularly dramatic because it occurred at Riverside Hills High School during her senior year, in front of classmates and teachers who had witnessed years of her privileged lifestyle funded by money stolen from me. The charges were serious and comprehensive. Brad faced felony counts of theft, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Diane was charged with conspiracy, money laundering, and accessory to theft. Madison, despite being a minor during most of the relevant period, faced charges related to her recent involvement in accessing and spending money she knew was stolen from my accounts. But the most shocking development came when the district attorney's expanded investigation uncovered additional criminal activity beyond the theft of my education funds. The forensic accounting examination of Carter Family Motors revealed systematic tax evasion, insurance fraud, and embezzlement from business accounts that had been ongoing for years. Apparently, my family's financial crimes had extended far beyond stealing from me. They had been underreporting business income, filing fraudulent insurance claims, and manipulating financial records to avoid taxes and inflate their apparent wealth. The total amount of financial crimes they had committed exceeded $500,000, making this one of the largest white-collar crime cases in Riverside County history. District Attorney Jennifer Martinez held a press conference announcing the charges and explaining the scope of the investigation. This case demonstrates that financial abuse within families is a serious crime that will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, she stated. The defendants used positions of trust to systematically steal money from a family member while engaging in broader patterns of financial fraud that affected our entire community. The criminal charges transformed the community's perception of my family overnight. People who had admired their apparent success and social status suddenly understood that their wealth had been built on theft and fraud. The contrast between their public image and their criminal behavior became a cautionary tale about the dangers of judging families by their external appearances. But the criminal investigation also vindicated years of observations from community members who had noticed something wrong with how I was treated. Teachers, neighbors, and family friends who had suspected abuse but hadn't known how to address it felt relieved that their concerns had been validated and that appropriate action was finally being taken. The civil litigation proceeded in parallel with the criminal case, but the criminal charges gave us enormous leverage in settlement negotiations. David had been right that defendants facing potential prison time were much more motivated to resolve civil claims quickly and generously. Sterling, my family's attorney, approached David within days of the arrests with a settlement offer that was dramatically different from Brad's insulting proposal during our apartment confrontation. The family was now offering to pay the full amount of the stolen funds, plus interest, legal fees, and additional damages for the harm their actions had caused to my education and career prospects. But the settlement offer came with conditions that revealed their continued attempts to control the narrative and minimize their accountability. They wanted confidentiality agreements that would prevent me from discussing the case publicly and non-disparagement clauses that would restrict my ability to share my story with others who might be experiencing similar abuse. David and I discussed the settlement offer carefully, weighing the benefits of immediate financial recovery against the importance of maintaining my ability to speak freely about what had happened. Ultimately, I decided that accepting restrictions on my speech would undermine the broader purpose of exposing family financial abuse and helping other victims. The money is important, but it's not the only thing that matters, I told David. If I accept a confidentiality agreement, I can't continue to help other people who are experiencing similar situations. I want full financial restitution, but I also want the freedom to use my experience to make positive changes. David countered their settlement offer with our own proposal that included full financial restitution but rejected any restrictions on my ability to discuss my experience. Publicly, we also demanded that the settlement include acknowledgments of wrongdoing and apologies that could be shared with the community that had witnessed their treatment of me. The negotiations revealed how differently my family and I understood both the scope of the harm they had caused and their responsibilities for making things right. They saw this as a financial dispute that could be resolved with money and legal agreements. I saw it as a broader issue of accountability, truth-telling, and preventing similar harm to others. When settlement negotiations stalled over these fundamental differences, David and I prepared for trial while the criminal cases moved toward resolution. But we didn't have to wait long for dramatic developments that would change everything. Tyler, who had been largely protected from the criminal charges due to his age and limited involvement, decided to cooperate with prosecutors and provide detailed testimony about his family's financial activities and treatment of me. His decision to tell the truth, rather than protecting his parents and sister, marked a crucial turning point in both the criminal and civil cases. Tyler's testimony revealed additional details about the systematic nature of my family's financial abuse and their consciousness of guilt about their actions. He described family meetings where they discussed how to explain their differential treatment of me to outsiders and strategies for preventing me from discovering the stolen education funds. They knew what they were doing was wrong, Tyler told investigators. They talked about how Emma would be angry if she found out about the money, and they made plans to make sure she didn't find out until after college when it would be too late for her to do anything about it. Tyler also provided evidence about specific occasions when my family had deliberately humiliated me at public events, while knowing they had access to money that could have prevented those situations. He remembered conversations where Diane had expressed satisfaction about teaching me lessons about gratitude and hard work by denying me access to resources that were rightfully mine. But perhaps most importantly, Tyler's testimony revealed that my family had planned to continue their deception indefinitely. They had never intended to tell me about the stolen education funds or to provide any compensation for the harm they had caused. They had viewed the theft as a permanent transfer of resources from me to Madison and Tyler, justified by their belief that I was less deserving of family support. Tyler's cooperation with law enforcement was motivated partly by his own horror at understanding the full scope of what his family had done to me. As he matured and gained perspective on family dynamics, he had begun to recognize the unfairness and cruelty of my treatment. But his decision to testify was also influenced by his desire to avoid serious criminal charges himself. The district attorney had offered Tyler immunity from prosecution in exchange for his truthful testimony, recognizing that his cooperation was essential for securing convictions against the primary perpetrators. Tyler's willingness to tell the truth, rather than protecting his family, demonstrated both moral courage and practical wisdom about his own legal situation. Armed with Tyler's testimony and the comprehensive evidence we had gathered, prosecutors moved quickly toward plea negotiations with my family. The strength of the case and the severity of the potential sentences motivated both Brad and Diane to consider accepting responsibility rather than risking trial and longer prison terms. Brad was the first to accept a plea agreement, admitting guilt to felony theft, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty in exchange for a sentence of 2 years in state prison, plus restitution and community service. His plea included acknowledgments of wrongdoing that specifically admitted to stealing money intended for my education and using it for family expenses and luxury purchases. The plea hearing was held in Riverside County Superior Court on a Wednesday morning in late spring, just as I was finishing my final exams at Pacific Coast University. I sat in the gallery with David and Jessica, watching the man who had raised me stand before a judge and formally admit to systematically stealing from me for years. Judge Patricia Wong accepted Brad's plea, but not before delivering remarks that captured the severity of his betrayal and the broader implications of family. Financial abuse. Mr. Carter, you held a position of ultimate trust as the father and legal guardian of the victim in this case, Judge Wong stated. Your systematic theft of funds intended for her education and future represents a profound violation of that trust and a failure of your most basic parental responsibilities. Judge Wong continued, the evidence shows that you not only stole money that belonged to your daughter, but you allowed her to suffer financial hardship and public humiliation while you used her money to fund luxury purchases for other family members. This court finds your conduct to be particularly egregious because it combined theft with psychological manipulation, designed to make the victim blame herself for the financial struggles you had artificially created. Watching Brad stand silently, while the judge detailed his crimes and their impact on my life, was both satisfying and surreal. For years, he had been an authority figure whose disapproval I feared and whose explanations I accepted even when they seemed unfair. Now he was being held accountable by a higher authority who understood exactly what he had done and why it was wrong. Diane's case proceeded differently because she initially refused to accept responsibility and attempted to blame Brad for decisions she claimed she had opposed. But the evidence of her active participation in spending my stolen money and her attempts to manipulate witnesses ultimately convinced her attorney that a plea agreement was her best option. Diane's plea hearing was more dramatic because she broke down crying while admitting guilt and attempted to deliver an apology that revealed her continued failure to understand the impact of her actions. I never meant to hurt Emma, she sobbed. I thought we were making decisions that would benefit the whole family. I'm sorry if she feels that we treated her unfairly. Judge Wong was not impressed by Diane's conditional apology and her continued attempts to minimize her responsibility. Mrs. Carter, the evidence shows that you were a primary architect of the systematic financial abuse that Ms. Carter experienced, the judge stated. Your attempts to characterize deliberate theft as family financial planning suggest that you still do not understand the gravity of your crimes or the harm they caused. Diane received a sentence of 18 months in state prison plus restitution and probation, reflecting both her significant role in the financial crimes and her lack of genuine remorse for her actions. Her sentence also included community service requirements specifically related to educating others about financial abuse and its impacts on victims. Madison's case was more complicated because of her age during most of the relevant period, but prosecutors ultimately decided that her recent actions warranted adult charges. Madison had continued accessing and spending money from my accounts even after turning 18 and learning about the criminal investigation, demonstrating a level of deliberate wrongdoing that justified serious consequences. Madison's plea agreement included juvenile penalties for her minor actions and adult consequences for her recent crimes. She received a suspended prison sentence contingent on completing restitution payments, community service, and counseling. Programs designed to address her entitlement and lack of empathy for victims of financial abuse. But perhaps most importantly for my own healing, Madison's plea included a detailed apology that acknowledged the specific ways her privileged lifestyle had been funded by money stolen from me. Standing in court and hearing her admit that her designer clothes, expensive parties, and luxury car had been purchased with money intended for my education provided a closure that I hadn't realized I needed. The criminal resolutions cleared. The way for finalizing our civil settlement on terms that met all of my requirements for financial restitution and public accountability. The final settlement required my family to pay the full amount of stolen funds plus interest, which totaled over $170,000. They also paid my legal fees and additional damages for the educational and career opportunities their theft had cost me. But beyond the financial recovery, the settlement included public acknowledgments of wrongdoing and formal apologies that could be shared with the community that had witnessed their treatment of me. These acknowledgments specifically admitted that their actions had been motivated by favoritism rather than legitimate financial planning, and that they had deliberately deceived me about the existence and theft of my education funds. The restitution payments were structured to ensure that I received the money in time to address my immediate financial needs while also providing long-term security. The settlement paid off my existing student loans, provided funds for graduate school if I chose to pursue advanced education, and established an investment account that would support my career development and financial independence. More importantly, the settlement gave me the resources and freedom to pursue opportunities that had been denied to me during my undergraduate years. I was able to accept an unpaid internship at a prestigious marketing firm that I couldn't have afforded without the settlement funds. I was able to move to a better apartment and focus on my studies without the constant stress of working multiple jobs to survive. But the most meaningful aspect of my legal victory was the platform it gave me to help other victims of family financial abuse. The publicity surrounding my case had prompted dozens of people to reach out with similar stories, and I began working with advocacy organizations to provide support and resources for others experiencing financial mistreatment by family members. I testified before the state legislature about proposed reforms to trust and estate law that would provide better protections for young adults whose education funds were being managed by family members. I spoke at conferences about recognizing and addressing financial abuse within families. I worked with attorneys and social workers to develop better resources for victims who needed legal help but couldn't afford expensive representation. The advocacy work gave deeper meaning to the pain and struggle I had experienced during my college years. Instead of just being a victim of family financial abuse, I became someone who could help prevent others from experiencing similar harm and provide support for those who were working to escape abusive situations. 6 months after the criminal sentencing, I graduated from Pacific Coast University summa cum laude with a degree in business administration and a clear vision for my future career. The graduation ceremony was attended by Jessica, Sarah Martinez, Principal Roberts, and several other people who had supported me throughout the legal process. But the most meaningful moment came when Tyler approached me after the ceremony to congratulate me and to express his genuine remorse for the family's treatment of me. "Emma, I know I can't undo what happened or make up for all the years when I benefited from money that should have been yours," he said. "But I want you to know that I understand now how wrong it was, and I'm proud of how you fought back and made things right." Tyler's growth and recognition of the truth about our family dynamics gave me hope that at least one family relationship might eventually be repaired. While I had no intention of reconciling with Brad, Diane, or Madison, Tyler's genuine remorse and commitment to making amends suggested that he might become someone I could have a healthy relationship with in the future. As I walked across the graduation stage and received my diploma, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The mysterious text message that had started my investigation seemed like it had happened in a different lifetime, to a different person who had accepted unfair treatment because she hadn't understood her own worth or rights. The woman who graduated that day was someone who understood the power of documentation, legal advocacy, and strategic thinking to address systematic injustice. She was someone who refused to accept explanations that didn't match the evidence or to be silenced by people who wanted to avoid accountability for their actions. But most importantly, she was someone who had learned that the truth really does have power that lies and manipulation cannot overcome. It might take time, courage, and persistence to expose that truth, but once it's revealed, it changes everything, in ways that can never be undone. A year later, I was working as a marketing coordinator for a nonprofit organization that advocated for financial literacy and abuse prevention. The work was meaningful and well-paid, allowing me to build the kind of life and career that my grandmother had hoped her bequest would make possible for me. Brad and Diane had both served their prison sentences and were living quietly in a different state, having sold their Riverside Hills house to pay restitution and legal fees. Madison had completed her community service and counseling requirements, but had not attempted to contact me or rebuild any relationship. Tyler had enrolled in community college and was working part-time while living with relatives. He sent me occasional updates about his progress and continued to express remorse for the family's treatment of me. While our relationship remained cautious and limited, I appreciated his efforts to acknowledge the truth and take responsibility for his part in benefiting from stolen money. The auto dealership had been sold to pay criminal restitution and civil judgments, ending the Carter family's prominence in Riverside Hills business and social circles. The contrast between their former status and their current circumstances served as a powerful reminder to the community about the consequences of financial fraud and family abuse. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the impact my case had on expanding legal protections for other victims of family financial abuse. The legislation I had testified for was signed into law, creating new requirements for transparency and accountability in family trusts and education funds. The law also established new criminal penalties for family members who systematically steal from or financially abuse relatives, ensuring that future victims would have better legal remedies and that perpetrators would face more serious consequences. As I reflected on everything that had happened since that fateful text message, I realized that my family's betrayal had ultimately led to something more valuable than the money they had stolen. It had led to my discovering my own strength, building a career focused on helping others, and making changes that would protect future victims of similar abuse. The rags they had forced me to wear to school events had been meant to humiliate and diminish me. But the orange jumpsuits they wore to court had been the result of their own choices and actions. In the end, justice had been served not just for me, but for everyone who had ever been forced to accept unfair treatment from people who claimed to love them while systematically stealing their futures. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.